my field, in the Department of Political Science at Politics and International Affairs at Florida International University. He has been teaching there since 1986, where he directed the Latin American and Caribbean Center from 1994 to 2007. In 2016, he was appointed founding director of the Latino Public Opinion Forum at FIU's Stephen Green School of International and Public Affairs. Dr. Gamarra received his PhD in political science from the University of Pittsburgh in 1987. While at Pitt, he wrote his first book, which is entitled Revolution and Reaction, Bolivia, 1964 to 84, with Professor James Malloy. Since then, he has co-written or co-edited 12 books and close to 100 scholarly articles on Latin America and the Caribbean. His most recent work, Culture and National Security in the Americas, was published in 2017. His topic today is democratic backsliding in Latin America and what can the Biden administration do. So, welcome, Dr. Gamarra, and thank you. You're muted. There you go. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kushlis, for this kind invitation. I do want to thank Rosanna Jordan for putting me in contact with you, and I especially appreciate the opportunity to share some views about really the first 100 days of the Biden administration and what might be his approach to the region. Let me share with you, just for the conversation, a few slides that'll guide my my talk here. So I'm going to try to share this. You see my screen, I hope, correct? Okay, great. So begin by noting, right, that it's probably too early. In fact, it is too early to analyze what the administration's policy toward the region will be. In fact, you know, most of the personnel that will be making the key decisions, that will be implementing the key decisions on Latin America, have yet to be named. There are nominations, a nomination, for example, to the post of Assistant Secretary of State have just been made. And there are a few others that have been filled, but for the most part, it's very difficult to really get a sense right now of former officials. You know, I subscribe to the idea that personnel is policy. So I'm really looking forward to some of those names, and some of the names that are already been nominated, of course, are people that have a long trajectory in foreign policy and a long trajectory in Latin America. People like Juan Gonzalez, people like Roberta Jacobson, people like Ricardo Zúñiga, for example, who bring with them a wealth of experience that is particularly important in the context of the administration that just left us, an administration that didn't value personnel, that didn't value experience in foreign policy making, and that in fact proceeded to a large extent to dismantle much of what was the, I would say a very significant public good, which was this enormous wealth of foreign policy making toward the region. So let me begin with that observation, right? I think there are a few indications of where this administration might go. But again, although I started with this observation criticizing the Trump administration, it's also very simple to argue that this administration is essentially going to pursue dismantling whatever it is that Donald Trump tried to do, right? I think there are many criticisms today in the very polarized political system that we live in that basically is arguing that what our president is doing today is simply dismantling whatever Donald Trump tried to do. So I think it's important then to look at what is it that this administration has been putting forward. And I think in that sense, it's what I will do is sort of review a very important document that that is out there and that in my view establishes a blueprint for this new approach to the region. But let me begin by saying that what I think does drive the way in which the administration is looking at the region is this idea that context matters, right? And context matters in the sense that for Joe Biden, it's not 2007. It's not even 2017. The context has changed dramatically as a result of the pandemic, as a result of the economic crisis, as a result of the 4-year push toward isolationism, but most importantly, a context, which I'll get back to in a moment, of the crisis of democracy, or what some people are calling the democratic backsliding on a global scale, right? So this is a very significant context that essentially establishes the playing field through which, in which this administration will be looking at Latin America. So now, so what is the blueprint? And I think the main blueprint is this document, this speech that Anthony Blinken, our Secretary of State, put forth a few weeks ago. And I don't think that this document has received enough attention other than, some very quick kind of punditry with respect to its central elements. But I think it's really important to look at this document in large measure because it gives us, to a certain extent, a philosophical brute through which we can look at what this administration might do in Latin America and elsewhere, right? And this document begins with a very important premise, which again tells that while the United States seeks to re-engage the world, there's also an inward-looking approach as well, because the way in which this administration appears to be thinking now is that, they're asking the central question: what's the impact of foreign policy on the average American worker? And by extension, what can the US do in the United States and abroad? I think this is what makes it kind of interesting. What can the US do domestically to promote foreign policy? I'll get back to this in a moment because I find this to be a rather significant approach. Okay, now let me then say that from this perspective, at least I garner at least 4 key points that emerge from that document and from the way in which Joe Biden has been talking, and again, some of those officials who have been articulating a vision of US policy toward the region. And the first and most important thing is this US leadership, reasserting US leadership and re-engaging the world basically through diplomacy, right? I'll get back to this as well in just a few moments. But this idea of re-engagement is central to the thinking of administration. And I think in terms of at least my conversations with a few colleagues who are in this administration and are working toward establishing this blueprint, right? That re-engagement is not just about re-engaging Europe and the main allies. It is about re-engaging Latin America as well. And in that sense, then, cooperation is a central element, cooperation to achieve change. And then, something that to me is really very, very significant, because it appears again as of this blueprint, this rejection of military action to achieve change, military action to do anything And except for, as they argue, right, except when American lives are at stake or when American interests are at stake. That's in fact how this administration has justified the bombing of the Iranian militia groups in within Syria, for example, right? But at least in terms of this, straightforward rejection of military action to do things like promoting democracy, to do things like reestablishing the presence of the United States in the world, I think it's a very significant premise. And then the other thing that's really important, and we'll get to this in a moment, is this idea, right, that the is not looking at short-term solutions, is not looking at things that are short-term in nature, but it wants to find the root of problems, right? To find long-term solutions. And I'll get back to this in a moment in my commentary, because obviously, while I find this attractive and interesting, it's also important to put it in the context of how viable is this approach, given the minefield of politics in which we live, right? So having said that, right, and going back to this idea that really it's a profound understanding of the current context that drives this administration. And, for that matter, we might say that it's particularly true with regard to the immediacy of the crisis on the border, right? Much of what this administration is doing, while it has a framework that deals with the important, in large measure, it also has to address the urgent matters such as the border. In fact, the border issue, one might say, is largely consuming a lot of the political capital that this administration had, right? But the second element I think is interesting, and that is that James Rosenau is very much alive in the analysis of foreign policy, right? Because there is this absolute understanding today that there is no boundary between foreign and domestic policy, right? In fact, it might be that old adage from Tip O'Neill that all politics is local, right? Well, certainly all politics is local for the United States. We've always said that. But I think we're getting to that understanding that all local politics is also global politics, right? When we look at the significance of immigration, for example, when we look at the significance of how the United States has been looking at Latin America in large measure through the eyes of communities who reside here in Miami, the Cuban or the Venezuelan or the Colombian communities, for example, we understand the significance then of the intermestic, right? The intermestic affairs largely are guiding the way in which the United States will be looking at the world and through this at Latin America, right? So let me very quickly talk about a few of these priorities and what their relevance might be to Latin America. This interim strategic guidance that was put forth by the administration basically, establishes something which is obvious, right? The fight against COVID-19, of course, is the priority of every government in the world, right? And of course, the global economic crisis, which is obviously related to COVID-19, is a major priority. What's significant, though, is that, in this document, Latin America is not mentioned with regard to these two areas. And yet, as we know, Latin America has had the unfortunate reality that a few of the countries there are among the leaders in the world, not only in terms of contagion, but in terms of deaths from this illness. And what has been striking, in fact, is that the United States has been utterly absent in the Latin American attempt to solve this issue. For example, if we look at vaccinations, right? The United States has not been present in terms of vaccinations. And this is an area where this administration in particular could assume leadership. could engage very forcefully and should do so immediately because of the situation that is occurring in Brazil and the fact that Brazil has borders with nearly every country in South America, and that the variant of COVID affecting Brazil is now affecting Bolivia, it's affecting Peru, it's affecting Colombia, it's affecting Venezuela, to name a few. So here's an enormous opportunity where the United States says it wants to exert leadership, right? But it's not exerting leadership, and this is an opportunity for the Biden administration to do so. And I would argue that the same thing goes with the economic crisis, right? Where most of Latin America, of course, has suffered. In fact, the Economic Commission for Latin America says that GDP for the region has fallen by over 8%. And in some countries, of course, some specific countries, the situation has even gotten worse. So again, here's an opportunity for leadership as established by the blueprint, but yet there is no mention of Latin America, and there is no real evidence yet that that kind of engagement is coming. Let's hope that it does, right? The other element of this blueprint is this idea of establishing a humane and effective migratory system, right? And here is the only mention that this administration in its blueprint gives to Latin America, right? And as I noted earlier, this is the intermestic issue of great relevance. It's an intermestic issue that has electoral consequences in the United States. And already what we're seeing is the public opinion polls are giving this administration a very negative evaluation of its handling of the crisis at the border. And at the same time, the naming of Vice President Harris, while I think it's a very, very appropriate naming, right? Leadership on this issue is a minefield, especially if we put this in the context of, right, here is an urgent matter that requires an urgent solution. But the administration is saying that it's looking for a long-term kind of structural solution, right? Which is clear that that needs to happen. It needs to work in Central America in doing away with the structural conditions that give rise to these waves of immigrants, whether it's the hurricanes or what have you. But the reality is that making a long-term argument to solve the immediacy of the border crisis is a political minefield. And it's a very strong political minefield, especially for Vice President Harris. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, especially as individuals like Roberta Jackson and Jacobson, pardon me, and Ricardo Zúñiga are currently today in Central America, talking to the leaderships down there about ways to approach this crisis. So again, this is a main issue, but it really illustrates how intermestic we become and how often politics seems to drive our domestic politics seems to drive our foreign policy agenda, right? Now, there's another concept that this administration has been throwing around, which I find extraordinarily important. So they're not only dusting off Rosenau, right? But they're also dusting off Alexis de Tocqueville, right? And you know, I'm in de Tocqueville with my students. I often do, right? I always have them read chapters 4 and 5, and that's exactly where de Tocqueville talks about enlightened self-interest, right? The idea, right, that I'm helping you because in helping you, I'm also helping myself. This idea, right, is being pushed as the logic behind why the United States needs to revitalize interests, revitalize alliances and partnerships throughout the world. Token, right, at least people like Roberta Jackson, Jacobson, and Ricardo and Juan Gonzalez constantly talk about this. how there is an enormous need to revitalize those alliances with Latin America, those old relationships with Latin America that were lost over the last 4 years and that now need to be revitalized. This is, I think it's, this idea of enlightened self-interest is interesting because I think that, that the administration is correct. Reestablishing these partnerships with Latin America is in our interest. It's in our political interest, as I said, because of the intermestic, but also just simply in terms of security over the long term. Enlightened self-interest, may get us better results than pursuing unilateral agendas. Okay, now within all of this, right, Latin America is also central in terms of climate change, which again, this administration has established as a priority. Now it's a global phenomenon which plays dramatically, intensely in Latin America, especially in the Caribbean and in Central America with hurricanes and floods and other natural events that occur every single year, right? And which most analysts, and if you are all in Arizona, and there's some really good studies, in fact, from your university on what are the major causes of immigration. And so there's already, several years ago, studies that demonstrate that causal relationship between climate change and migration flows. So here's a very important moment in which this administration could, combine climate change, this approach to climate change in terms of this long-term kind of resolution to the immigration problem. And clearly, it's also an opportunity to change the framework of energy, especially through the promotion of wind and solar. And if there's a place in the world where solar might be effective, it's certainly in Central America, in the Caribbean. Right? Now, the US also wants to reassert technology and leadership. And here, Latin America doesn't appear to play any part of this consideration. And here I want to say something which I'll come back to in a moment, because the leadership in technology in Latin America, number of different counts. So this obviously ought to be an area of critical consideration for this administration as beyond its 100 days. Now, I just mentioned China. And this is really very important to examine, because the administration identifies a whole series of threats around the world. It identifies Russia as a threat. It identifies, many countries in the Middle East, the situation in Yemen, the situation in North Africa with Ethiopia, and so on, as major threats to the United States, right? No country in Latin America is seen as a threat to the United States. And this is often a surprise, especially to my Cuban and Venezuelan students here in Miami, who think, of course, that the gravest threat to the United States is Cuba and Venezuela, right? But from the perspective of this administration, it's the Chinese who are the major threat. And they see that threat, right, defined in the following terms, right? It is the only country, Blinken says, right, with the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power, right, capable of threatening the stability of the international system, of an open international system. Well, if there is one measure of Chinese presence in the world today, it's the presence of China in Latin America. The enormous presence of China since the middle of probably the first 5 years of this century, right? Let us not forget that Brazil came out of its economic crisis in 2005. Argentina came out of its crisis in 2005. Bolivia came out of its crisis in 2005, largely by exporting soybean and minerals to China. Let's also not forget that China during this period has largely been extraordinarily important in terms of investment in Latin America. At last count, Evan Ellis at the National War College, of course, has been writing extensively on this, and probably the number one authority on how the Chinese presence in Latin America. Probably close to $400 billion of Chinese investment in the region, and investment in infrastructure as well, but also the forward presence of Chinese companies. And at the same time, the enormous presence of China in the financial system in Latin America. For example, just in Venezuela, right? The Venezuelans have a debt of about $60 billion with the Chinese. The Bolivians, a much smaller country, have a debt of about $13 billion with the Chinese, right? So the presence of China has become an omnipresence in the very same context in which the United States is perceived as having removed itself from the region. So as a priority area for thinking about the Chinese, it's really trying to reposition the United States vis-a-vis China. And here I want to something else that's important. The Chinese have been they've been engaging in military training. Their warships now dock regularly in Latin American ports, right? They engage in joint training with Latin American armed forces, right? But not just in the countries that are anti-American, right? But they also engage in countries like Colombia, for example, that are very good friends of ours, right? So the Chinese have been using, not on the security side, an important presence, but really the presence that they have established, which is extraordinarily important, is in soft power. And this is where, I think the US is lagging enormously for a couple of reasons. First, because we didn't pay attention to the region over the last 2 years, right? Not the kind of attention that we should have. Now, that inattention, of course, accelerated over the last 4 years. But the other thing that accelerated over the last 4 years is something that I think is important as a talking point. The United States was one of those shining lights on a hill, right? That our presidents used to talk about. The United States, and many of you probably engaged in these activities, in soft power, right? In promoting the anti-corruption programs, in promoting democracy, in promoting a whole bunch of things that had nothing to do with the security side of things, at least not directly. But the US has essentially lost its capacity to influence the world, and Latin America in particular, as a result of our internal democracy crisis, right? We are no longer that example, right? That we can now go and tell Latin Americans not to be corrupt, or others not to engage in attempts to overthrow democratically elected leaders. And so let me finish my presentation here by providing a few reflections on another area that this administration seems to want to be remembered for. And it's an old idea, and again, most of you were involved in this as Foreign Service officers, right? And that was the promotion of democracy. And more importantly, right, it was the promotion of liberal representative democracy. But now the reality is, as Blinken says, and as I think is very, deeply ingrained in the thinking of our officials in Washington today, that democracy is threatened all over the world. And there are two forces that are threatening democracy: authoritarianism and nationalism, right? Now, I want to stress, here that while the Biden administration, is looking probably at Putin and is looking certainly at what's happening in Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua and so on in our region, right? But also at China, right? much of what really colors the thinking of this administration is January the 6th, right? And they say so explicitly in terms of their not only conversations, but in terms of this blueprint, right? And so the idea is that, you know, Washington now must engage, must reestablish leadership in rescuing liberal democracy from these forces. And of course, you know, from my perspective, Latin America appears to be right in the midst of this threat, and how it's carried about, of course, is really important. So, you know, so as I said, it's this crisis of democracy in the US and elsewhere, right? It's that legacy of Donald that seems to be driving so much of the thinking in Washington. But it's also a careful analysis of a lot of the public opinion data that's out there, that, you know, the World Values Survey, the Freedom House kinds of studies, but also things like the LAPOP, the Latin American Public Opinion Project at Vanderbilt University, and Marta Lagos's Latino Barometer, for example, which for years have in Latin America and now increasingly in the United States, that citizens no longer trust their governments. They no longer trust their leaders. They no longer trust their institutions. In fact, something I always note, this is recovered slightly. In some public opinion polls, for example, the US Congress had an approval rating of only 13%. That's even lower than most of the measures taken in about Latin American legislatures, right? So this collapse of trust and confidence in democracy, in representative democracy, is something that is, you know, it's a reality. How you recover that, of course, is really the key. And a key dimension of this, to be redundant, is of course corruption, right? Because citizens appear to lose trust in government, right, and their institutions because of the overwhelming of corruption, right? And for us, of course, it's kind of a chicken and egg situation, because, you know, we're saying that, you know, we have a crisis of democracy. Democracy is caused by too much corruption. So, and a lot of this is, you know, promoting the fight against corruption has to involve a great deal of soft power, and soft power is what lacks right now in our country the most. Another dimension of this, right, which we have just gone through, we're still struggling with it, not just in the state of Georgia, but elsewhere, but it's this idea of flawed elections, right? Flawed elections in Latin America are a critical problem. There was a major fraudulent election in October of 2019 that led to violence and to, you know, to the even, you know, curiously, the return of illiberal Democrats to the government there. But it's also led to the emergence of other illiberals, and I'm going to talk about them very, very quickly in just a moment, and how the U.S. appears to be taking this. So, in addition to all of those things, right? World, most of our countries are deeply polarized, right? And polarization is largely driven by leaderships. It's not that societies are as polarized as people like to see them. In fact, the public opinion data that I just cited tells you something quite interesting. Even in the United States, most citizens are sort of, you know, around the middle. In Latin America, they might be around the middle, maybe tending a little bit toward the left. But for the most part, the citizens of Latin America are right in the middle, but their leaderships are way off in these polar opposite directions. And it's these polarizing leaderships that have made it so difficult to govern, right? Because, you know, what polarizing leaders do is they have polarized electorates. And these polarized electorates pardon a lot of the things that these leaders do. It's that old adage, right, of I can shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and I will have very little consequences. That very same thing, right, that very same idea pervades much of the way in which some of the Latin American leaders behave, right? The other thing, of course, is the reemergence of racism and the deepening of inequality, in large measure in the context of the pandemic. And then if you add to that this other global phenomenon that we've been experiencing over the last few years, which is the enormity of disinformation, right? And how governments themselves, these polarizing leaders, disinform their citizens in order to achieve political gains, right? So this, again, right, I haven't really contributed much in the sense that I'm essentially reading what this administration is saying, right, is both the diagnosis of the world and how they propose to solve it. So how do they propose to solve it? And this is where it becomes interesting, right? And it's always that criticism of academics that we receive, right? You're really good at diagnosing the situation, but how would you solve it, right? Well, this administration is essentially saying that they want to incentivize democratic behavior, right? How are they going to do it? They say they will fight corruption, that they will end unjust practices, but most importantly, that they'll do the use of the military. This is still, in my opinion, much too abstract. Hopefully it will have some meat in practice, but at least for the Latin American case, in some measure, this appears to be what many in Latin America want to hear. But most importantly, as I said earlier, this requires an enormous amount of soft power at a time when it is extraordinarily scarce. And so let's take this idea, right, of incentivizing democratic behavior and look at, what really, it seems to me, is here at play, right? Because authoritarianism and nationalism, right, are major forces in Latin America today. They are very present throughout the region. And how kind of look at those forces, right? It's a rejection of, right, things like, well, from the administration's perspective, at least it should be, right? It's, we have to reject the concentration of power in the executive branch. We have to be wary of, the disappearance of the oppositions and the establishment of single party systems. We have to be very alert when we see in societies throughout the region that the media is disappearing, that plural media is disappearing, and that the pattern of disinformation is extraordinary, right? When governments are using the means of communication as a way to promote, propaganda more than anything else, right? The other very difficult thing is the personality that appears to be, such a prevalent trend in our hemisphere, right? And then finally, and perhaps the most important thing in terms of the illiberal options that I'm enumerating here, right? It's the fact that in those regimes that I'll mention in just a moment, there is no separation of powers. There's, above all, the use of the judiciary as an instrument to advance the objectives of these authoritarians and nationalists. This should be a major concern in Washington, and I think it is. But how they do it, right? If you take out the threat of the military, right? How do you do it? By incentivizing democratic behavior. At the moment, it appears a little weak. Now let's look at this. Let's look at some of those illiberal regimes in the region. And here's my worry. Last week, there was a major hearing in Washington in the Senate, which evaluated the state of democracy in Latin America. And at that hearing, there appeared to be, especially among my colleagues, my academic and think tank colleagues, a great deal of concern about El Salvador and Brazil, right? Two countries that are on the right, right? Two countries where, you know, in the case of El Salvador with Nayib Bukele, who won elections, right? Who now won legislative and municipal elections and has an overwhelming majority in Congress and controls municipal governments as well, right? And or the case of Brazil, where, you know, this populist president, a great admirer of Donald Trump, has been performing not only poorly but horribly in terms of the pandemic, right? But our concern with a crisis of democracy in the region or the trend toward authoritarianism appears to focus solely on those governments that are on the political right, right? While very little, in fact, close to nothing, is said about trends in governments that are trending left, right? Even though I think in conversations with our officials that they have correctly, right, and appropriately, when they have the opportunity, condemn these regimes as well. Whether it's, as Secretary Blinken did, for example, when just a couple of weeks ago, the government in Bolivia jailed the former president, Janine Áñez, and is keeping her in pretrial detention, you know, arbitrarily, right? This administration noted that, right? The same thing, you know, some of the declarations that have been made about Venezuela, I think are absolutely appropriate, as well as those regarding Venezuela, Nicaragua. But like with everything else, you know, it doesn't seem like we're thinking that the crisis of democracy is as serious in regimes that trend left, and we're much more concerned about regimes that trend right. And one thing that particularly concerns me is what I have heard, that this administration plans to use El Salvador, right, as the case study for its application of this notion, right, that it will become the promoter of, right, of liberal representative democracy, and it will, you know, fight against authoritarians and nationalists, right? So in any event, let me end there. I've already spoken for too long. I think I've provoked you enough, and so thank you very much for this opportunity. So I'll be glad to take any questions.